It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining me to talk about the book Made This Way, How to Prepare Kids to Face Today's Tough Moral Issues is Leila Miller. Thanks for being here, Leila.
I'm so glad to be here, Kyle. Thank you.
I know you have kids of your own. What's the hardest question your own kids have asked you recently?
That's a great question. This is going to sound really self-serving and weird, but because I use the approach in the book, which is to teach them from the time they're little, kind of natural law understanding of things, they really haven't asked a lot of difficult questions because they see the world as making sense the way that God created it. So I guess the way to answer that question is I have gotten questions over the years from some of my teenagers just about certain things that they've heard at school or certain terms that they need explained.
Yeah.
And those are the tough ones for me because, you just hate to have to discuss these issues. But we do that with just complete non-freak out mode. We don't freak out. We don't, change our face to look horrified or, make them feel ashamed for asking. So those types of questions are the ones that are difficult because you have to, unfortunately, bring a lot of what the culture is saying into your home and then talk about it. But as far as explanations, that's kind of why I wrote the book, is because I didn't have a difficult time explaining it to all 8 of my kids. Mm-hmm. If you start early and lay it out well, it can go pretty smoothly, and I want parents to know that.
How do we as parents get our kids to come to us in the first place instead of turning to friends, or now I suppose the internet would be the anonymous way to look up these questions that you have? Mm-hmm.
Again, that's going to start, and I know a lot of people, maybe they're out of the starting gate here, and it's a little too late for this part of the advice, but little kids are naturally disposed to trust their parents. That's what they do. That's how God created them. So we have the authority over them to tell them the truth, and they will receive that, and they won't really reject it when they're little. If you have always told them the truth and always been a friendly parent in the sense that they can come to you and they have a good relationship with you, it's not, at least in my experience, and again what the Pontifical Council of the Family has said in their documents of how to teach kids on these tough issues as well, it's not going to be a huge battle once they hit their teen years. It's kind of when we start to doubt ourselves as parents when they're little and start to think, well, what do I have to say? I don't even know what to tell them. And so the confidence issue for parents is huge, so that when they are little, you cultivate that trust, and then they get older and they are going to want to come to you first. And I have found that to be the case. My friends who have used the same approach have found that to be the case. So it's so key that we get them to trust us young, but God already worked that out because they do trust us when they're young.
Do you think in general it's gotten more difficult to talk to kids about morality in recent years?
Yes, absolutely, because of what they're facing. So I have kids from the ages of 27 down to 8, and I can tell you it's like 2 different cultures that I've raised these kids in. So we raised the first few kids in a culture where we weren't talking about LGBTQ stuff, and we weren't talking about, transgender wasn't even a thing before even 3 years ago, I don't know.
Right.
So that wasn't discussed. And so those first kids, we didn't have that. And it was probably the same types of issues that even our mothers and grandmothers had to deal with, or grandparents. But now, it's a completely different landscape out there. So we are having to tackle it in a different way. And the culture is forcing our hand as parents because now there is no protection from the culture, even in children's movies, children's shows, music, the arts, the schools, the libraries. Everything is trying to force your hand and to sexualize your child or normalize, deviancy with your child very early on. And that was never the case even 5-10 years ago.
And you mentioned a couple of the topics that you cover in the book. Can you go over some of the other topics that you consider to be the tough moral issues?
Absolutely, and they're all connected to the use and misuse of human sexuality, even though some of them might not seem completely connected, but they really are. So we do sex outside of marriage, same-sex marriage, divorce, contraception, abortion, reproductive technologies, including IVF, modesty, pornography, which includes masturbation, and transgender identity and homosexuality. So all of those are tackled in the book, and not in a way that's difficult. It's actually, we try to make it really user-friendly and give some practical tips on each one of those. And what we do is we try to educate the parents first. So we give a whole section on what the church teaches in a very clear way, and then how to speak to little kids on that issue, and then how to speak to teens or bigger kids on that issue. And it's all based in a natural law understanding that can be understood by the use of human reason. So it's the way we really need to be teaching kids, and we've kind of thrown that out for the past few decades, unfortunately, in the church. So we're bringing it back.
Yeah. And that layout of the book of having each chapter divided into what the church teaches, advice for little kids, advice for big kids, I think is such a great way to do this book, and a really clever way to do it too. What do you consider little kids versus big kids?
So we go by what the church, the Pontifical Council for the Family, had released a document called The Truth and Meaning of Human Sexuality in 1995. Little kids, the age of innocence or the latency period, as JP2 talked about, is generally from the age of about 5 to puberty. So puberty is kind of the dividing line. So we're talking maybe middle school, possibly up into the early high school, but usually nowadays it's middle school that might be the dividing line, so that the more in-depth discussions of these issues would come around 12, 13. You want to still be careful, but each parent is going to know what their child needs or how advanced their child is or what their child has been exposed to, and you kind of have to go with that. But the younger kids, especially before the age of puberty, we really want to respect that innocence, and we don't want to bring in details of human sexuality unless it's already been breached, and then you have to tread really carefully as well.
Yeah, almost kind of triage the situation. And I imagine that's the hard balance is sometimes you want to bring things up before they encounter them, so they know that, you can come to me whenever this happens. Like, for the example, kids and pornography, I want my kids to know, hey, you're going to run across this someday, and I want you to come to talk to me about it. But at the same time, you don't want to pique their curiosity in the wrong way. So how do we balance that with kids?
Right. So again, we have to go back to the idea that we do have the responsibility first to protect the kids. And that is, make sure that they don't have access to a computer that's not, that's somewhere private, or that you're not seeing what they're doing when they're little. Make sure that they're in a school. We actually had to make a switch. We had to make a switch from a school that was a public charter school because there was an atmosphere that it was really cool that there were 2 lesbian parents in my little kindergartner's class in first grade. Again, something I never would have encountered in the first few years of raising my older kids. Right. And we had to make a decision because my son came home in kindergarten and said, Mom, girls can marry girls. And I just had to stop, and we had to have a discussion in kindergarten that I didn't want to have at all. So not only did we have that discussion, which I actually recount in the book, but also we decided within a year or so, we're going to just quietly move him to a very Orthodox Catholic school. So he's going to be sheltered from that for a while. And then our kids, as they get older, they go into more of the, we have classical charter schools here in Arizona, and they have to then defend their faith, but they're able to do so because they've had that protection for those first few years.
We're talking with Leila Miller. The book is called Made This Way, How to Prepare Kids to Face Today's Tough Moral Issues. And what do you think is the worst thing that parents can do when trying to address tough topics with their kids?
The worst thing you can do is to freak out. So I always say that. Do not freak out. There is absolutely nothing good that can come from freaking out if your kids bring you something that they need to know that anything at all that they need to talk about, they can come to you with. Mm-hmm. And that is so important. And the minute that you feel, I always say, if you have to act, then act. Be an actor. You can be dying inside and collapsing inside, when they come to you with what does this mean? Or what? I just heard this. And you may want to flee from the room and run. You just stay calm. You can stuff all that inside and freak out later privately. But you need to be the parent, and you need to be there talking to your child face to face with an eye contact. Trust me, they need that. They want that. And they don't want to go to the peers and to the internet to get their information. They will do that the first time you freak out. They will never come back to you. So be very, very careful that you know your role. And your role is to be the adult and to be the authority. And gosh, parents do not have confidence anymore. They really don't. And I think a lot of that has to do with bad catechesis, because I was raised in the 70s and 80s, and that was horrible catechesis. So that's why we specifically said we're going to be stealth catechizing the parents in this book as well, because you have to be one step ahead of your kids with the knowledge of how God designed us and why this makes sense and why this is reasonable and why the world will make sense to them when they know this. And so it's going to make sense to the parents too. So, do not freak out and pray a lot.
And pray a lot, yeah. Why do you think it's easier for us to talk to our kids about math, spelling, reading? It's easier to talk about those things than it is to talk about the issues that you're talking about in the book, which are obviously more important.
Mm-hmm. Well, for two reasons. Number one, because it is innately delicate. You don't want to expose little children to these things. It's not for them. And you have a culture that is saying it is for them. And unfortunately, that's a corruption of small children. And we have to be the ones that are able to be socially shamed, if we have to be, by our neighbors, our friends, the teachers, whatever, even doctors, everyone. So that is one huge reason. But then I touched on the other, not only because we have to be delicate, but because we don't want to be socially shamed, so we kind of want to avoid the whole thing so that we don't look like meanies, either to our kids one day or to the neighbors or to our relatives who have a different idea, because the narrative is all one way. It's that the church is mean and terrible and bigoted and nasty and horrible, and they hate people and don't want them to exist, and then everyone else is just tolerant and good. So we have to get over our, complete aversion to being socially shamed, and we have to be willing to do that because that's what Christ calls us to sometimes, and he was shamed socially, and he had to suffer too. So we have to be able to own that as Catholics.
Can you run us through one of the topics, whichever, I don't know if it's the most important one or maybe the easiest one to explain, and the 3 tiers that you have for the topic in the chapter?
Sure. So, let me think, which would be a good one to do here. So we've got like reproductive technology. Okay, that's kind of a touchy one because a lot of Catholics use IVF, and so the first part would be the teaching of why. Why it's an injustice to make a child into a commodity just because we want a child. A child is a gift. So we go through what the church teaches about that, and the only person who has rights in this issue is the child. The only person. Parents do not have a right to a child. So we go through and we explain why that is, and we talk about that in reasonable ways and church teaching, and to be able to access just that church part of it, and the natural law part of it, why this is wrong. Then we would go to little kids. So little kids don't necessarily need to know about all the ins and outs of IVF, but you might start to just train them in understanding certain things. Like you play little games with them, things like, here's the baby. Look at the little baby doll. Where does the baby belong? Here's the mommy. Does the baby belong in with the mommy? Yes, the baby belongs with the mommy. Would we ever put the baby in a freezer? No, we would never put the baby in a freezer. It's silly. Would you put the baby on a shelf? No, we'd never put the baby on a shelf. Things like that. So you can sort of, and then you start to teach them, once you were the size of a little period at the end of this sentence, that was you were this size, and we could even determine if you were a boy or girl. Science could even tell, and things like that. So you tell them, from the beginning, this is a human being. And then once you get into the teen years, you can explain and show what has happened in the exploitation of women with buying and selling of eggs and the hormones that are pumped into her body that are dangerous, and the children who are now killed by the hundreds of thousands because they're excess embryos, and that we don't oppress and use human beings that way. That's not what we do. And things like the donor children themselves are starting to speak out now and saying, you obliterated our fathers. My father was the man who was paid to masturbate and then walk away from me forever. Now, we have such social justice sensibilities now. A teenager should be able to say, that doesn't seem right. Someone gets paid to walk away from their child forever, and it just doesn't seem right. So, there are ways to talk about this as you get older and ways to set them up for it when they're small.
All right. Well, I think this is such an important book, especially today. And so I want to make sure people know where they can find more information about you, about the book, and get a copy of it as well.
Sure. So shop.catholic.com is the Catholic Answers store, and actually people are buying in bulk. You can get it for as cheap as $5 a book and do like a group study with friends at the parish or whatever. Also, it's on Amazon. I'm at leilamiller.net, so it's Leila Miller.net. That's one of my sites. And I also used to blog at Little Catholic Bubble, which is about 8 years of archives of topics like this, which are of interest to people. So, and I have a big Facebook presence as well. So.
All right. And also the book was written with Trent Horn, one of the Catholic Answers apologists. It's called Made This Way, How to Prepare Kids to Face Today's Tough Moral Issues. Thank you so much, Leila Miller, for joining us today and sharing this with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kyle. Take care.